Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the JRSA webinar on issues in using administrative records. My name is Stan Wachowski. I'm the Research Director for JRSA. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Before we get started, I wanted to just run through very briefly a couple of just technical issues with you. If you need any technical assistance at any time during the webinar, you can send a chat to the JRSA webinar or send an email to webinar@jrsa.org and we will try to help you. We encourage you to ask questions of our presenter. To submit a question for the presenter, you can send a chat to me, Stan Wachowski. You should see the chat window in your window in the WebEx software. And we will have some time in the middle of the presentation to stop and answer questions, and as well as some time at the end of the presentation. So if you do have questions, please feel free to type them in and send them to me. Before we get to our speaker for today, I wanted to turn this over briefly to Dr. Jerry Ramker, who is the Deputy Director at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, who is sponsoring today's webinar. And Jerry wants to say a few words about BJS's interest in the use of administrative records. Jerry.
Thank you, Stan, and thanks to Joan, Karen, and the other JRSA staff for putting this session together, which we hope that SACs and others listening in will find very interesting. I did want to just take a couple of minutes and talk about BJS's interest in administrative records as a way to introduce today's presentation. And many of the SACs out there, the State Statistical Analysis Centers, BJS has been tapping into administrative records for a great deal of time. And we rely heavily on the work of operational criminal justice agencies for both responding to traditional paper and pencil surveys as a source of our statistical information, but increasingly as a direct source for providing records, statistical information by tapping into their own administrative or operational record systems. For instance, in the past, we've produced felony case processing statistics, information on pretrial detention, all of which historically relied on criminal court case files, a source of administrative data for the information that we ultimately published. A large area for us is our National Corrections Reporting Program, or NCRP, which increasingly relies on extracts, not quite yet full integration of State Department of Corrections record management systems for providing information on incoming inmates and exiting inmates. More recently, we've talked about this at some length with SACs, is our initiative to tap into state and FBI criminal history records, which again is another example of administrative records that are used every day in the criminal justice system to support a statistical mission. In this case, largely that work is focused on supporting recidivism studies, national recidivism studies, but we think increasingly those records can offer statistics in other areas, booking statistics, for example. In the future, we're also looking at tapping into records of adult protective service agencies, for example, or even victim service agencies to generate for us statistical data and serve some of our partner agencies in the Office of Justice Programs. You've also heard, I hope, some information about an initiative we call NCSX, or the National Crime Statistics Exchange, which largely is focused on enhancing and improving participation in the FBI's NIBRS program. But an aspect of that we're envisioning will engage some of the largest police departments in the United States to extract, see if we can integrate systems with their police record management systems to extract incident-based crime data for use as national statistics. So in a lot of ways, BJS and many of the SACs we recognize have been engaged in tapping into administrative records to support our statistical missions. I think it's important to say that at the outset, too, that certainly part of our rationale has been economic in nature. We believe there's efficiencies that can be gained, and we can be less burdensome on our respondent agencies that supply much of our statistical information. I think there's a great potential, and we're seeing this a bit in terms of our use of the criminal history records, to take advantage of certainly federal funding that has flowed to the states and local agencies to improve information systems and technology generally, as well as in certain areas money that has been focused on improving the accuracy, completeness, and data quality of administrative record systems. So in that sense, we think that they can offer those benefits as well. And by the same token, the things that can be benefits can be major challenges in this regard. So data quality remains an issue that needs to be addressed when you are proposing to engage administrative records for statistical purposes. And I think we're fortunate today to have a presenter that will discuss experience and issues faced in a non-criminal justice domain, but nonetheless there are lessons that can be learned and best practices that can be identified. And again, my thanks to JRSA and Dr. Culhane for today's session that I hope you will find enlightening and useful, and perhaps be a kickoff point for future webinars in this area. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Culhane.
Thanks, Jared. This is going to be the first in a series of webinars on this topic, and we wanted, as Jerry said, we wanted to start off getting everybody on the same page in terms of issues associated with administrative records. We wanted to have an expert come and talk to us today about that, and so we've tapped Dr. Culhane, who is the co-PI on a really interesting project called Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a professor there and is primarily known for his work in homelessness, but has used administrative records extensively in a number of different areas, including youth and transitioning from foster care and the juvenile justice system, residential treatment facilities, and so really an expert on this topic. And I had the pleasure of hearing him present at a seminar back in December, and I thought it was a really useful and interesting oversight of the various issues that we all have to face and are going to have to face as we start using these records. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Dennis.
Well, thank you, Stan. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you, your colleagues, and the folks who are joining us on the webinar. I did not become an expert in administrative data intentionally, and I certainly didn't become expert in all the challenges and obstacles that are faced when trying to do research with administrative data. It came to me quite by accident, but after many years of toiling away with administrative records to try to understand the homeless population, as was mentioned, I have found that that the payoff is great. So although it seems tedious at times, and there's a lot of work that has to be done to try to take administrative records and get them into a research-ready state, the payoff is significant, and the learning curve is really the thing that you want to advance, because once you get better and better at this, you can do it quicker and faster, and the payoff is therefore that much better. In terms of the presentation today, the overview slide here that I'm showing is I'm going to list the various topics that I'm going to be providing. Now, go to the next slide, actually. The various topics will include looking at, we have one next slide. I have issues in using administrative records. Do you have overview slide?
Oh.
We're stuck. Well, while they work on that, let me just say that there's about 8 or 10 topics that I will be discussing, and they're listed here. I don't need to go through them. There you go. You know, I will try not to be too boring in working through these. They mostly address a range of challenges that have to be addressed when you're trying to work with these data, and we'll go through that accordingly. So, the next slide. And I guess we're still having technical difficulties. We're not able to advance the slides. Okay, so the first question, of course, is one of definition. What is an administrative record? And what are they? So this is not a Webster's definition, it's my own definition, but essentially describing them as data which are routinely gathered for the operational or business purposes of public or private agencies. The typical ones that you might be familiar with from government might include things like the corrections data, prison records, for example, that you may deal with, or incident data from police departments, but can also include such things as Medicaid claims, vital statistics, birth and death records, school attendance and achievement, labor wage data, parking violations data. Essentially information which is part of the routine of the business practices of these agencies. The key distinction here is that administrative records are not collected for research purposes. So they do not have many of the characteristics of research data in which you have, they're explicitly collected by trained recorders, people who understand the various minutiae of the response types. So they are not as clean as survey research records or other research records. They're intended for an administrative purpose, and that's a key to keep in mind, because one of the major issues that actually goes across a lot of the challenges with administrative records is we're not intended for research purposes, yet we are using them for research purposes. So some examples of common sources, the next slide please, for justice research include incident reports and arrests, family court records, those can be juvenile probation records or placements, corrections data, in addition to the ones that we just mentioned. All right, next slide please. In terms of the some of the strategies for accessing these records, depending on the data source, there may be different legal requirements that may be in place that prevent you from being able to access them, or at least limit access. And many of those are obviously for legitimate purposes. These may be confidential patient records. They may be confidential social client or service records. They may be confidential student records. And even some criminal records, for example, for juveniles, are confidential. It turns out many of the corrections data, of course, don't have that same level of privacy, but there are still data security issues, and not all data which might be collected as part of a correctional agency. Some of them are still protected by HIPAA. There may be health information, for example, that's included. So that's one of the issues. Anyway, here are the strategies. We're going to talk about the way that most agencies or researchers who are really the business agents of agencies are able to access the data. They have a memorandum of understanding that's signed between the university or the data receiving agency plus the data source. There may be a data exchange agreement, which is a DEA or a DUA, data use agreement, which is additionally specified. Usually an MOU is in place that permits agencies to work together, and then each specific use is authorized by a data use agreement or a data exchange agreement. Very often there might be in a given jurisdiction or an agency an oversight board that you have to approach. You may even have to make a presentation to justify a request to get their permission. Oftentimes, government agencies will make relationships with research organizations, with colleges or universities. One of the advantages of that is that the colleges and universities, by law, if they're getting any federally funded research, have to have an IRB. And that IRB makes it possible to have the protection of human research subjects, an institutional review board that gets to look at the human subjects issues, which is important because, as you probably know, many of you, that any research done on prisoners, including data which is collected on prisoners, so even if you're not directly working with people in prison, is considered a special population for which there is a required full review by IRBs. So even if it is administrative data and it would normally be expedited, because it involves prisoners, it would have to go through a full IRB. One alternative for dealing with some of the data privacy issues is if indeed an agency doesn't want to share data because they have protected health information or other things and they don't want to share with you identifiers, you can use a common encryption tool. And there are software packages available that would enable you to encrypt the data from source A, encrypt the data from source B using the same code, and then link them on the basis of that encryption. As long as a third party that's neutral holds the encryption key, and neither of the source agencies can actually unencrypt the data. So that's an alternative. But in the end, I mean, although there's many ways to try to get around or to accomplish, you're not trying to get around, but you're trying to accomplish protecting security and privacy issues, it's key to have political support as far as you can high up in the agency, because those are the folks who can help to make sure that there's careful consideration to the request, and it's not just stopped on the basis of, we don't like to share data. And so having engagement with senior administrators, having them interested in the project is an important thing. Okay, now we've talked about some of the other, being some strategies for accessing. I'll talk also about some of what are the barriers that one might have to address in trying to access these. You mentioned the legal barriers. It's important to remember that any agency that holds source data, the source data agencies, they have legal obligations with regard to these data, and so they're going to have to protect those, and that's why you're going to have those legal agreements. In addition, there might be some political barriers, like some agencies may be in conflict with each other. They don't like to share data. They may have a turf issue. This often occurs with different levels of government, so you might have a conflict between the county and the state, or between a city or a township and a county, different levels of legal responsibility, and that may well create a political challenge, and so those are things that one has to be aware of. There may also be problems with the data in terms of quality of the data, and agency staff who are responsible for administering these data may not want others to know that the data they have has some bad data in it, or that there's data quality issues. So sometimes folks will not want to share data because they want to protect discovery of the problems that they may be having with their data. And in addition, there are also this is not simple. As the data were not created for research purposes, they're not as easy to analyze as survey data. So it does take a certain kind of analytic savvy to understand how you do the record linkage with these kinds of sources, how you have to look for data quality issues, how you, what kind of analytic strategies that you might use. So, there are additional barriers such as that one has to be aware of. On the next topic, I'm going to talk about data quality specifically. Now, we generally, think about the data quality issues in administrative records as dealing with the top three things bulleted here: coverage, completeness, and accuracy. Coverage refers to the degree to which the extent of the phenomenon is actually covered by the data set. A lot of data sets may have holes, especially if you're rolling up sources like, say, from county to a state level or from townships and things to a county level, that you have 100% reporting. Or there may be pieces of the system, because they're not part of the criminal justice system, let's say, that the county or the towns are usually administered. Maybe there's a housing authority police database, or there's a school district police database, or the Amtrak police database. So one really may not have 100% coverage on all the incidents, for example, in a particular jurisdiction, because there are so many authorities, and so you don't usually have 100% coverage. So that's one thing you want to assess when you're doing administrative records research, is what is the coverage and what are the limitations. Secondly, even though you may have good coverage, data sets are not necessarily complete. You may get a file layout from a particular data source that says, oh, we collect everything from A to Z, but in fact, really only 5 or 6 items are actually collected on a complete basis. There's time pressures involved, there's workflow demands, and many agencies usually complete only the things that are absolutely necessary, the bare minimum necessary to pay bills, to manage placements, to get people to do their job. But generally speaking, there's lots of missing data, and can compromise the integrity of a research project, especially if there's any kind of bias with regard to what sources are complete, or which variables are complete and which ones are incomplete. And then third thing that's very key, obviously, with the administrative data is it accurate? Is the information which is completed validly measuring the information it's claiming to collect? And for this, generally, you have to rely upon whether agencies actually audit their records. And many agencies do routinely audit their records. They look to see, if there was a paper-based form that led to the data entry, they'll compare them to see how accurate they are. Or they might take a sample of the records and actually go to other documentation to see whether in fact it's accurate, or call people who may have completed information to see if it was accurately collected. There are a number of ways in which administrative records can be audited, and so usually things that have anything to do with money, certainly, paying bills for people in a placement, paying doctors, paying provider organizations. Those things tend to be audited because of financial compliance. So they generally have a higher level of accuracy. But not every field in a data set will never necessarily have that same level of accuracy, and one needs to know that. Okay, so in terms of some of the other ways that one deals with data quality, and I know we're going to be talking about some examples later on, but I just wanted to recognize that when you do these administrative records projects, there are a number of approaches to, and by the way, the other items there, data audit, validation checks, and chart reviews, both of those relate to ways of auditing for accuracy and completeness. This issue of data linkage approaches, I just want to mention that generally speaking, there are 2 types of ways that these administrative records can be linked. One is using exact name match, or doing an encryption and doing an exact match on the encryption. The second might be what's called probabilistic matching, which is where even though you have a name and a birth date and a social security number, there may be keystroke errors in one data source relative to another, and so what it looks for is the closest match on basis of the strings of those characters instead of an exact match. And you can actually set the tolerance level in some of the software which is available for this. You can set what is your tolerance for an exact match and how precise do you want it to be, balancing type 1 and type 2 errors. A software that's made available through SAMHSA, the federal agency, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, is called LinkKing. LINKKING, and it's actually free, and you can download it. And we use that as our primary tool, but it's essentially a software that enables you to do these record linkage and set all these decision rules. All right, so let's talk a little bit more, if we can, about some of the legal issues. I just want to mention, so folks are aware of what the different legal issues are. By now, most people in the United States, because they go to the doctor, have heard of HIPAA. And HIPAA is the Privacy Act that relates to the protection of a person's health information. FERPA is a comparable federal law, but it relates to the protection of school information. Anyone dealing with juveniles, for example, or like in a juvenile justice program, oftentimes there's a school on grounds, and those school records would be protected by FERPA. Any education record, primary, secondary, post-secondary education, is protected under FERPA. And then there is the common rule, which is a general federal statute that covers the privacy of social service information and client information. Now, each of these statutes have differences to them, but generally speaking, it is true that they all have provisions for the use of administrative records, including identified records, for the purposes of research and evaluation activities. I can't get into all of the specifics of these things, but there are resources available on the web where you can get guidance on what HIPAA, FERPA, and Common Rule are, how those things will, require you to address them in your projects. Generally, another thing to know is that there are three types of ways in which identifiers are or are not used in a data set. So identified data is when you do have protected identifying information in a data set. That could include name, date of birth, social security numbers. This is typically within a government agency where they have authority to have that information. That information is available. They use it for record linkage, and they can do analysis and research. It's generally not recommended that you do your research on an identified data set, even inside an agency, because you don't want to mistakenly disclose data. Generally, people are encouraged to assign a study ID and strip the identifiers and keep that linkage key in a separate location, but do your research on a de-identified data set. Now, but the fact of the matter is that although we might think of a data set as being de-identified, I've removed the names, I've removed the social security numbers and the birth dates, the fact is, if there are things like diagnoses or charges or any dates related to services that were delivered, it's actually technically not a de-identified data set, because it is possible that someone who wanted to could re-engineer the data in some way to try to identify a person who, let's say in a health record, there are only so many people who had a labor and delivery charge in this hospital on this date, and and so one could feasibly narrow down in the records to an identifiable person. So that kind of data set would be called a limited data set in the HIPAA world. FERPA doesn't have a distinction to describe something called a limited data set. But limited data set is permitted as a researchable data set as long as there's a data use agreement in place. De-identified data, a purely de-identified data source, is actually something that's considered a publicly accessible and usable data source in many cases. But a limited data set, it is required that there be a data use agreement, and that the researcher, the person who has the data, has to demonstrate that they understand what are the restrictions with this data. It usually has a time limit associated for data destruction, and you have to certify that those data are going to be destroyed. And again, you'll have to have a legal agreement, an MOU or a DEA, if you're going to get a limited data set or an identified data set. Now, the one last issue I just want to point out is that sometimes you're working with a data source that the source agency has, for whatever reason, either in their own opinion or in fact under legal rules, they do not feel permitted to even create an encrypted file or do a temporary record linkage, even though it's going to eventually get to the researcher without any identifiers on it. An example of things like this could be earnings records. Let's say you wanted to see about prisoners who've come out of state prison. You want to see how many of them end up employed and what are their earnings and how many quarters of work do they have, etc. So you have to, there you would be linking with the State Department of Labor, which collects the unemployment insurance records, which is the wage and labor records. Or let's say you're looking at HIV. The HIV registry that health departments maintain under federal requirement has a very specific high security data standard to it, and they generally do not share data. So an alternative is that you may be able to bring your data set to them, and you can sit alongside them while they do the data linkage, or they may just do the linkage and analysis for you and return to you the results. So the way to get access to these very restricted data sources, but generally it requires you to bring your data to them under you'd have a data exchange agreement or an MOU, and they would do the linkage, they would do the analysis, and then you would be working from there. Okay, so hopefully that's something that one might be able to find. Certainly, some of those data sources, earnings as well as some of those the health and disease registry data, are very interesting, I would think, for a corrections population. So what are some common analytic strategies? You probably, many of you are, as researchers, you're familiar with lots of different ways in which you analyze your data. I will just say that there's some advantages to administrative records that are not typical to survey research. And what is it that one might want to use administrative records? What unique, or rather I should say relatively unique advantages do administrative records hold from a data use perspective? Well, clearly one is service utilization research. Aside from knowing how many people are incarcerated or were in some level of incarceration, certainly one of the more interesting questions is to identify typologies of people who are using these different programs based on how they use those programs. So you might have people who have a one-time only encounter with the system, you have people who have repeated contacts with the system, or you might have people who have only one or two contacts but they're very long-term in nature. One could come up, the great advantage of administrative records tracking use of these programs is that you can come up with different profiles of service users and look at their characteristics. And you can be thinking about program strategies that are specific to those subpopulations based on that service use. So one of the very powerful potentials that is there with administrative records. Another is a whole series of event history studies. Event history is a class of techniques that deals with the time-dependent nature of data that one might be looking at. And there are a whole series of tools that have been developed, statistical tools that are in this class of event history, and one can take mini courses, 1 or 2 week courses on some of these techniques if one were so interested. They're available on the web and elsewhere to learn more about how one might use these techniques with longitudinal data, but they're designed for longitudinal data. Some examples include survival analysis. A lot of these were developed, in fact, around disease and health matters. But being able to look from the time someone enters a program, how long is it till they leave the program? So you do survival analysis for that. You could look at hazard functions. What's the likelihood of an event occurring? Let's say reincarceration. One was interested in trying to see what's the probability of someone getting reincarcerated, and how does that change from day 1 that they exit through to day 365 that they exit. That varies by that time, and one could look for when are the peak periods of likelihood of reincarceration, and then could you in fact target interventions based on that. So there's a whole series of these event history techniques that are useful for when you're dealing with people for in and out of an institution, and that there's time exposures both in and out of that. A third technique that is very common in criminal justice research, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, is time series analysis. But very often we're trying to understand, are there social and ecological phenomena that are related to changes in crime rates, arrest rates, etc. And time series analysis is perfectly suited to that. And usually this involves aggregate measures of administrative records. Certainly crime incident data is probably the most commonly used data among criminal justice records for time series analysis, because you're trying to see, does the variation in a particular offense as it occurs over time change as a function of other factors in the community or that are extant in the society. Lastly, another powerful tool, analytic tool, that is well suited to administrative data and not as well suited to survey research, for example, would be looking at cost offsets. So because you have administrative records, usually you're tracking what happens to someone, what services a person is going through, what episodes of admission and discharge to a facility they may have had. That, therefore, gives you the number of days, it gives you encounters, if you're talking about probation encounters or outpatient therapy encounters, etc. And you could assign a dollar value to those things, and you can look to see whether various interventions that are targeted to different groups, in fact, result in a reduction in other uses of services. So does a community-oriented corrections program that does the transition back to the community, let's say that costs $3,000 for a month of a 30-day, post-discharge intervention, does that result in reduced commission of crime or reincarceration? And if so, how many days of reduction can be attributed to that intervention? And that gives you the ability to do a cost offset analysis. And it's very useful to look at whether programs are being paying for themselves, as you will. All right, so considering some of the implications of, broadly here about why administrative data is useful from a social policy and implications perspective. Well, the most obvious is that unlike survey data, which is collecting information directly from people about their attitudes and behaviors, these data are actually about what these public agencies are doing. What agencies keep track of is who do they serve and what do they serve them with, how do they, what services are given them, etc. So you are using the data, which is in fact the language of these agencies. It's how they spend their money. So instead of having to try to think about policy implications of your research, in fact the research is full of policy implications because you're describing the actual practice of these agencies. So from that perspective, the translation of the data for for public agencies is that much more intuitive and obvious. The second is that public officials are very sensitive to the cost of various programs. They have budgets, they have limited budgets, they have to do as much as they can with limited resources. So a big part of the advantage of these data sources is that you can translate administrative activities into costs fairly directly for measuring whether programs are efficient or they yield any cost savings. I caution a couple things just because it comes from my own experience in the homelessness field. A lot of people like to overpromise, that certain interventions produce cost savings, and it's very important to understand that in the real world, when things are done in a naturalistic way, it was not done in a research way, very often programs are targeted to particular groups that can't be generalized to the whole population overall. The common mistake, for example, is that if an intervention was targeted at people who are, significant, let's say, chronic offenders in the jail system, in the local jail system, the frequent flyer types, and you did a diversion program for them, well, you couldn't necessarily generalize that to all jail users because most jail users are only in jail for a day, 2 days, 3 days, less than 5 days. and they don't come back repeatedly. So I think it's important just to understand that, remember that when you're doing things in a naturalistic setting, that you have to be careful not to overgeneralize, and then you understand that there's been selection effects and the selection biases in who is selected to study. So in any event, those are some of the implications that we deal with in the research we've done specifically, as I can relate, in homelessness, which has lots of crossovers with the criminal justice system. A couple other things I thought we might talk about is related to the publication and dissemination issues. Because you're working with agency data, because these data belong to these public agencies, they may not feel as free with the dissemination of results based on those records as you might with a survey research project, for example. Usually in a survey research project, the investigator has control over the records and is free to publish from them. But when you're working with the public agency records, generally speaking, the agencies will want to delimit what it is that can be published from these data sources. So we always stress, when I work with other researchers, that it's important to make sure that there's opportunity for a preview of those results, that it's good to include agency researchers as co-authors, because one of the concerns an agency might have is, well, what if in the conclusions of your paper you recommend something that's totally against our agency's ethos or what we might recommend? Well, if you include the agency researchers as co-authors, then as co-authors they can raise those objections with the other co-authors and say, we really can't say that because that's not what our agency has. So a way for the agency to protect its views and interests with respect to these results. And obviously, you can't change a number and say, well, let's change that number 85, if don't like it, and turn it into a 20. But when it comes to the interpretation of the data, you can change the interpretation and say, well, from the agency's perspective, this isn't necessarily the same way. So it does require a little compromise of certainly what we would consider academic freedom, but it does create a process whereby there's better buy-in on the part of the agencies to share ownership of the work product. It's very important that when you do this kind of research that you decide beforehand who actually is going to own the research results. The challenge of working with universities is that universities generally have a rule that states that the researcher owns the data, the results rather. They don't own the data, but they own the results, and they can disseminate as they see fit. So in some cases, then agencies might choose, well, maybe I like to work with Professor so and so, but I don't want to work with her on the basis of her being a professor. I'll hire her as a consultant. And if you hire her as a consultant, you can then, therefore, restrict dissemination to what the agency agrees to disseminate, because it's no longer part of a process with a university-based researcher. So there are a number of ways to work around that, but you certainly need to decide that beforehand. And lastly, these projects can get pretty complicated. The statistics can get steep. And so we certainly encourage people when they're working with these public administrators to keep in mind their audience. You're generally dealing with executives of agencies who have very limited time to focus on these research projects. Results have to be distilled relatively quickly into what do I need to know, what do I need to know what to do about it. So having good executive summaries and concise results is always very useful, because a lot of these executive audiences are not going to have time to spend going over in great detail these things. So let's shift now to see if there's any questions at this point in the presentation.
Yeah, we just wanted to pause at this point and give you a chance to ask your questions, type them in if you haven't already done so, and before we move on with the rest of the presentation, we want to make sure that we address the questions you have. One of the questions that we have came in and wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about the encryption methods that you mentioned that can be used to address these confidentiality issues.
Sure. There's a software vendors. I know that SAS, for example, is one, but there are others who have encryption tools available, encryption keys, and what you can do is you can buy this. Essentially, it's a black box encryption key. No one really, only the manufacturer knows what the encryption translation code is. But essentially, that same code can be given to multiple data partners. They can take their identifiers and encrypt them so that it's read through and processed through the software and produced into a chain of numbers and letters that's not interpretable or understandable to anyone. And because they've been encrypted using the same tool, they can be matched on that basis. And you thereby have what is effectively a de-identified or a limited data set without any personally identifying information on it. But the tool is generally held by a neutral third party, which in some case could be the manufacturer, because in fact by buying this you don't even know how to do the encryption. The manufacturer may hold it, or in some cases where there is a known ability to unencrypt, because an agency may want to be able to at some point unencrypt the data if they have permission to do so at some point. Generally, you try to identify someone like the General Counsel's office in the agency, which holds on to the encryption key, understanding that they can only release the encryption key with the appropriate legal permissions. So it is a method whereby one can share linked records and no one actually ever gives up their identifiers.
I also just had my own question, which is that about HIPAA and FERPA, since you mentioned them, and you mentioned that there are sort of things in our research using the information for research purposes, but it seems like I have experienced myself and have heard from our members that this is sometimes put up as a barrier, and I think from other presentations I've heard that a lot of times it's just sort of so much of it is subject to the interpretation of the individual agency, and particularly the individual agency's lawyers. So that this becomes a way of sort of, it's a lot easier to just not give people access to the data than to try to, run any kind of risk at all that somebody's confidentiality might be breached. So I wonder if you could just, do you have any thoughts about that? And
I think it is most definitely the typical reaction of the General Counsel's office in a lot of these agencies is going to be, it's easier to say no than it is to say yes. And they are risk averse, as you said, so they don't want to have any potential exposures with their data being released. But the fact is that it is the case that under the common rule and under FERPA and under HIPAA that in fact research records administrative records can be shared for research purposes. There are exemptions within all of those laws, or provisions, it should be said, within each of those laws that permits access to them for research purposes. And there are presentations. Actually, I remember doing a presentation for OJJDP, I believe it was, in which case the expert on HIPAA came. And so there's a slideshow available which explains all of that. I actually have it linked on my website, Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, so you can find it there. But there are a number of resources, and there's ample precedent now. The other thing was FERPA. Now, it is true that, so HIPAA is very clear and was actually written with the research provisions in mind. FERPA was never written with research provisions in mind. It was mainly written with, let's stop people from accessing student records. So it's only come through subsequent guidance from the feds that we now have been, better understanding what's permitted. And in December of 2011, the Office of the Department of Education responsible for FERPA issued brand new guidance that really opened up the interpretation of the permissible uses of education records for research and making it, legitimizing the use of these records outside of school departments. A lot of things that school districts had previously thought were not possible are clearly explained now in the new FERPA guidances, saying that it is permissible to use these records for these purposes. So I think increasingly there's guidance available through the web, through either HHS or education, that explains what is permitted and what isn't, and I think that may be useful to folks. All right, so we're going to go to this example. All right, I'm going to, I got a lot of slides here, so I'm going to, as my colleague likes to say, we're going to water ski over these results. No scuba diving, but I wanted to illustrate to you the power of the linkage of administrative records for research purposes. And this is just one little example where, we took information about kids. The next slide actually describes the sample. We looked at youth who were going to be aging out of juvenile probation or aging out of child welfare, and looking, and of course a third group, which is the kids who were in both juvenile justice and child welfare, and looking at what happened to them as adults. Many folks who've worked with juveniles know that these high-risk kids, and that many of them face lots of challenges going into adulthood. So what we did was we basically looked at the kids who exiting probation, exiting child welfare, and the crossover group between 2000, 2001, and 2002, and then we followed them for through 2010. So we were able to look at them over an 8-year period after they had left. So most of them were 25 or 26 years old by the end of the observation period. And what we did was we used the encryption method, because that's the way Los Angeles does this. We used their encrypted identifiers, and we crosswalked them with all of these different county-funded agencies. Child welfare, did they have a kid in the child welfare system? Their Medi-Cal records from health, their mental health records, their jail records, probation, public assistance, substance abuse treatment, their earnings data, so workforce data, as well as their secondary and post-secondary educational achievement records. So we were able to look across this fairly broad spectrum of data sources to see, well, what happens to these kids when we don't do anything, just sort of left to their own devices, what happens. So I'm going to the next two slides really just go through quickly, because one is showing, we broke the results up into years 1 to 4 and years 5 to 8, but they essentially show the same thing, which is that basically there's high levels of criminal justice system involvement, especially among the juvenile probation exiters. 45% of them are have some kind of stay in the county jail in the years 5 to 8 after they've exited. Fully 62% of the kids who were both from foster care and in probation have had have been arrested in that period of time. And you can see here, going across these domains, whether it's public welfare, cash assistance, different health services, mental health services, the crossover group is significantly worse off than either of the others, and that the child welfare group looks to be more disadvantaged than the juvenile probation, other than through corrections. And obviously, being in corrections might prohibit people from using other county-funded services, so that may well mitigate that objective. But the general point being that you can see these are relatively high service users. They are in very significant amounts of contact, and in particular, what this slide shows. Oh, this is another. Excuse me. This is just looking at higher education, which is that, so I think the good news is that nearly half of the kids from child welfare attend community college, and 30% of the kids who have exited juvenile probation attend community college. But fortunately, their completion rates are very low. So only a few percent will actually complete their community college, and you do see that there's small percentages that go to other kinds of colleges or universities. Okay, so in terms of looking, other advantages I mentioned is we can look at cost. So we're looking, those are showing you just uses of various services, and in each one of those you could go deeper into what are the patterns of service use. But here we monetize that, if you will, and look at what's the cost of these different subgroups. And as you can see, in the first 4 years out, the juvenile probation kids are costing about $16,000 in these services, $12,500 for child welfare, and for that crossover group, $35,000. Most of the costs are tied up in criminal justice system costs. That would be basically county jail. But as you can see, what we're going to do here is apportion those costs to the various different county departments so everyone knows who's paying for this particular population. Interestingly, as has been seen in many other studies, it's a relatively small group of people, the top quartile, the top 25%, who is using 75% of all the resources being spent here. So at an average cost of $85,000 each. So if you could more effectively address the needs and of the top 25% of kids who have emancipated out and have become adults, you would actually yield 75% of the cost potentially could be offset in other programs. So if this kind of research, I think, and results that I said, wow, look at that high user group, that's a lot of money that if we could spend it in some better way, get that kid in some kind of supported living environment, maybe with a partial housing subsidy, get them in a more employment track-oriented thing, or get them into a more supported educational environment, we could avert these costs and possibly save resources down the line. So in fact, the implications that we learned from this study, and this study is available online, is that most of these kids continue to make substantial demands on public resources into adulthood, but it's particularly true for the crossover youth who comprise a particularly vulnerable group and should warrant special outreach. In fact, as a result of the study, the folks in Los Angeles have made a much more concerted effort to make sure that they try not to get they try to divert kids from the child welfare system who are going into the juvenile justice system to keep them in the child welfare system so that they don't end up with these multiple placements. And they're also looking at what's the supervision like in these group homes that the child welfare system is looking at, and what are they supporting. Okay, so that project that I just mentioned to you, the project from Los Angeles, is actually an example of a project that we are that's part of a network, a national network that we call Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. This is a project that, along with my colleague John Fantuzzo and I, we co-direct this. It's funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and what we've done is identified different counties and states that maintain a linked administrative record system, not for purpose of a single project or a single study, but for purpose of being able to handle ongoing inquiries and research projects and evaluation projects. What we've been doing is documenting what are the best practices for how a county or a state or a university would build an integrated data system. We've been working to promote and develop new sites, so we're working with a couple counties who are developing this capacity, and a couple states as well. And then we're also trying to raise funds from federal agencies and from foundations that are interested in accessing these integrated data systems to be able to look at issues like youth transitioning out of juvenile justice and what happens to them. And if a federal agency foundation wanted to be able to do that in 5, 6, or 7 locations, we can support that through our network. Our network, the next page actually just gives you a map of the sites that are involved in this network. They include 4 out of the 5 largest cities in the country. So you have New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Philadelphia. The mid-sized cities through their counties of Cleveland and Pittsburgh, through Cuyahoga County and Allegheny County, respectively, and then the states of Washington, South Carolina, Michigan, and Florida. Now, some of these are university-based. 4 of them are university-based. 6 of them are actually based in the counties and states. But they collectively represent 20% of the United States population. So we have a fairly significant proportion of and quite heterogeneous population for being able to look at people as they might move through these multiple systems. Just to give you some examples of the kind of projects we're doing, I've already mentioned the one here at the top of the list, which was we're looking at links between foster care and juvenile justice system involvement. What would be the best ways to prevent kids from crossing over from foster care to juvenile justice? What are the outcomes? What are some of the costs? I gave you the Los Angeles example. Another thing we're looking at is do recently returning soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan, are they getting incarcerated in local jails? There's a Justice InReach program that the VA funds. We want to know how effective is that program for actually contacting and reaching these folks. Once they do reach them, are they connecting them to VA services? Do they use VA services? And in the end, does that result in reduced rates of reincarceration and better health and outcomes? So we have that going on in 3 of our sites as well. And then another project we're doing, which is in 4 of our sites, is actually 5 of the sites, is we're looking at, does assisted housing have an impact on better educational outcomes for kids? So does having a Section 8 voucher, does living in public housing, does that promote housing stability? Does it improve one's access to better schools or neighborhood quality, depending on whether it's public housing or a voucher, versus no assistance whatsoever? And we're looking to see, does that impact achievement and attendance? So those are just a sampling of projects that can be done when you're looking across different of these silos. So we're looking at all the siloed data. Can we bring it together, and can we ways of understanding where populations could be benefiting from different kinds of interventions, integrated service models, integrated agency collaborations, things that would reduce duplication and better serve people. So you have on this last slide my contact information, and so I'm glad to be able to respond to any questions that folks have. If you want to send them to me there. You can see our website, which is this Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. That's aisp.upenn.edu, and you have my email address there. So glad to exchange with people that way. So I guess if you have an ability to field any questions any further at this time.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, I don't know if you've become a victim of the conference rules, but one of the great resources, and how I found you originally, was the conference you had a couple of years ago. I think it was in D.C.
Yep.
I think it was 2011.
That's right.
In the fall, where there were a number of papers on issues related to integrated databases and so forth. Have you had any more of those, and are you planning any more of those conferences?
Yes, we're planning a conference that will be in the fall of 2013. Probably be here in D.C. because we know our federal agency friends have restrictions on travel. But because we have this grant, we're able to fund the travel of our participants, the people who would be presenting those papers. Yeah, we're very interested in having a conference to showcase the research that's come out of these sites, and we'll likely be doing that sometime in the fall of 2013. We don't have a date just yet.
Okay. Any other questions? No. All right, well, thank you all very much. We appreciate your attending. Thank you so much to Dr. Culhane. I think that was very informative and kicks off our series on a great note. If you have any further thoughts, if you have any feedback, ideas for other topics, for other webinars, please feel free to email me, send me a chat right now, or email me at sorchowski@jrsa.org, and we'll try to make those happen. Otherwise, look at your email, look for announcements for future webinars in this series along the same ideas and topics. We hope to have one roughly every 4 to 6 weeks, depending. So please look for those too. And again, thank you all for joining me, and thanks to Dr. Culhane.